The College Football Playoff (CFP) committee has 4 explicit criteria to rank teams: strength of schedule, head-to-head results, conference championships, and overall performance. But there's also a 5th, unwritten rule that's been crystal clear over the years: Alabama always gets the benefit of the doubt. Let's be honest. You didn't think the committee would consider teams like Miami, Mississippi, or South Carolina over Alabama for that final playoff spot, did you? No, Alabama's scripta has a certain magic to it that the committee simply can't ignore, no matter how many losses the Tide rack up. Take this season, for example. Alabama is still in the playoff conversation after losing 24-3 to a 6-6 team. Why? Because it's Alabama. The Tide will be the first 3-loss team ever to make the 12-team playoff field, and that's no accident. Other teams may have impressive records, but Alabama's brand endures, even when it falters. It's the power of history and perception. Last year, the committee chose 12-1 Alabama over 13-0 Florida State, making the Seminoles the first undefeated Power 5 champion to be excluded from the 4-team playoff. The reason? Florida State's starting quarterback was injured. The committee used that as an excuse, even though the Seminoles had just defeated Florida on the road without him. It was a dubious decision, but it set a precedent. Alabama gets in, no matter what. Or remember in 2017, when Alabama made the playoffs without winning its division alongside Ohio State? The Tide went on to win the national championship that year. That victory became more evidence in the committee's unwritten rulebook that Alabama deserves a seat at the table regardless of flaws. As we head into the final weeks of this season, Alabama is again in the mix. With a 9-3 record, the committee has Alabama ranked at number 11, just 1 spot behind the automatic playoff spots. If Alabama wins, it will become the first team to make the playoffs with 3 losses. However, the Tide could still slide into that final at-large spot if other teams, like SMU or Boise State, lose their conference championship games. The rankings could change, but the committee might stick with Alabama despite those losses. For instance, SMU ranks ahead of Alabama, but would the committee choose them over the Tide if they lose to Clemson in the ACC championship? Or Boise State, ranked just above Alabama, but with a similar weak resume? You could already hear Committee Chairman Ward Manuel justifying Alabama's inclusion. Alabama has more wins against top 25 teams, has a tougher schedule, and despite the losses, they're still one of the best teams in the country. In other words, Alabama will always get a pass when things get tricky. The problem for teams like Miami, Mississippi, and South Carolina is simple. While they may have impressive records, they need to gain the same level of respect from the committee. Ole Miss, for example, looked great with wins over Georgia and South Carolina, but their losses, especially to Kentucky, kept them from moving up. South Carolina, with its head-to-head loss to Alabama, doesn't stack up in comparison. Then there's Miami, which has no signature victory. The Hurricanes' soft schedule does them no favors, and that's a key part of why Alabama's strength of schedule will always weigh more heavily than teams from smaller conferences or weaker Power 5 teams. So what does this all mean? With the expansion of the playoff to 12 teams, the competition for spots has become even more crowded, and the gap between teams gets smaller. Alabama's resume may not be the best, but it's still better than most other teams vying for that last spot. The committee's decision to include Alabama isn't an accident. It's been years. While it might seem unjust to some, the facts speak for themselves. The committee will always find a way to justify Alabama's inclusion, even if there are flaws in its record. The Tide will benefit from the doubt every time, and it's been that way for years. There's no surprise here. Alabama's place in the playoff has almost become a given, and that unwritten rule will continue to dictate the committee's decisions for years to come.